Yes.
Hey, we're ready. Okay.
All right, we're in business. Thank you so much. Apologies to those of you who are participating online. I already said my objectives. It's really to share out what we're doing, but get your inputs and feedback and invite you to participate. So let's roll to the next slide. Okay, so the place to really start is just to unpack a teeny bit this concept of ecosystem restoration and why tools and guidance were needed. So under the UN Decade, a really broad array of ecosystem management activities are included as restoration. And you can think of them as a raid along this restorative continuum that goes from, on the left, reducing impacts like in urban areas, right? And then all the way on the right side of this infographic, you have fully recovering native ecosystems. Next slide. And of course, that right side is the highest level of recovery possible, and that's defined as ecological restoration. And that's a field that's self-defined in the late, 1980s, and has like a clear set of principles and standards. But the UN Decade is more than that. It's all kinds of restorative activities in all kinds of systems. Next slide. Okay, let's skip these. This is unpacking ecological restoration, but I want to make up my 10 minutes. So go on to the next one and then go one more. And I just want to make the point about this whole continuum that we need restorative actions across the board. So in urban areas, in agricultural areas, and you can imagine the types of restorative activities would be really different based on the context. Next slide. And so one of the really amazing things about the UN Decade, which we are now, 3 years into, even though we're just 3 years in, it's already had a really large effect on the global restoration community by creating this common lexicon about what is defined as ecosystem restoration, restorative activities, and kind of what is that floor for ensuring net gain for people and ecosystems through ecosystem restoration. Next slide. As part of building this common lexicon, though, there was a need for principles to guide ecosystem restoration under the decade. Hopefully, many of you have seen these. There's a scan code if you hadn't. And this was the first sort of big product that CEM and its ecosystem restoration thematic group, and many of you in the room participated in order to set those defining principles for optimizing net gain from restoration. Next slide. And once the principles were adopted, the next thing to unpack was standards of practice, again, to optimize the benefits we're getting out of ecosystem restoration, because there is this broad array of activities. And these were launched in March of 2024. Again, there's a scan code. I think that scan code occurs a couple other times in my presentation too. And hopefully I had a couple of automations. Let's see if they work. Let's do the next slide. Yeah, okay. So the standards of practice was not something that we started fresh on for the UN Decade, but rather it was a product of the global restoration community. So we started with all the available guidance that we could find through a very thorough search process. And so as such, they're more comprehensive than anything else, because they were literally built from all the good work that had gone in from the global restoration community. Next slide. And here we've got all the different people who participated. I think there's like scrolling that'll get more folks. There were 33 authors. We're really pleased that we were able to do an Indigenous peoples consultation and include Indigenous authors. and we had 25 organizational partners. So when I say CEM was leading this process, it was part of the leadership team in truly a global process. Okay, next slide. So very quickly, the standards of practice are organized by components, and you can see them in this sort of flower infographic: assessment, planning and design, implementation, ongoing management, and monitoring and evaluation. And then within each of these components, there's subcomponents and then practices. We puzzled for a long time what to do about the fact that some activities within the restoration process occur throughout the process, like broad engagement by stakeholders, information sharing, adaptive management. And so we've labeled those as cross-cutting subcomponents, and they come up in each of the components, but the practices associated with the cross-cutting subcomponents vary based on by component. They vary by component. Okay, so next slide. All right, I'm going to quickly roll through the different components, and then again within each component there's subcomponents. So assessment is about understanding the context of your project, both at the site level, but also importantly at the landscape or seascape level. And so this tiers to this important principle that ecosystems do not occur in isolation. And so activities have to be planned in the context of the broader landscape. They need to include the socio-ecological system of the broader landscape. They need to be monitored in that landscape context. And also an assessment is the baseline monitoring and the development of the reference model. Next slide. Planning and design, the next component goes through creating your visions, targets, goals, and objectives, dealing with governance, dealing with tenure, dealing with prioritizing activities. All of that goes into a restoration plan, also laws and regulations, risk assessment, all of that are part of the subcomponents in planning and design. Okay, next slide. Implementation has to do with getting those treatments on the ground, but it walks through the safety and well-being of the implementers, compliance with laws and regulations. Again, specific practices for adaptive management go throughout the restoration cycle. Translocation of plants and animals, minimizing collateral damage, and of course, sharing out with the community. Next slide. We addressed ongoing management as a separate component, recognizing that practices associated with ongoing management are often neglected in restoration planning. So this is recognizing that restoration is a process and that you need to plan for that process in the long term when you're setting up your project. Next slide. And for those of you who have worked with me, I spend a lot of my time thinking about monitoring and evaluation. I'm here in Oregon teaching a workshop on monitoring and evaluation. I'm really proud of this component within the standards of practice because it goes through each step in thinking through how to develop an effective monitoring and evaluation program, including the importance of evaluating the effectiveness of your monitoring program in order to adapt it so that you are able to answer questions about the efficacy and effects of your restoration intervention. Okay, next slide. So I already mentioned one of the key contributions of the standards of practice is the engagement of Indigenous peoples in the drafting of it. They are co-authors of the entire document, but then they also participated in specific guidance within each of the components of the standards of practice through specific boxes, kind of unpacking what's coming in the practices. Next slide. Another key contribution is really like one-stop shopping. Everything is in there. But we did do global consultations on the standards of practice, and many people said, wow, this is too complicated. There's too much in here. There's over 300 recommended practices. And that brings me to the next part of the conversation. Let's go. I have one more slide before we get there. Okay, so we couldn't really simplify the standards of practice without losing important guidance. And the authors felt strongly that synthetic review and consideration of all the practices would lead to better projects overall. So to be clear, you see on the screen here, I've got, these are both in my local community in Western Montana in the US, a community-focused restoration program, no funding. On the right-hand side, a $200 million river restoration project that involved removing contamination and rechanneling a river. Obviously, very different projects, very different levels of resources. However, even a community project that may only be able to implement a couple of practices in the standards of practice can benefit by this synthetic overview by catching something they may have missed. However, it leads to the need to help the community. If we want these things used and adopted, we need to help the community navigate the standards of practice and figure out how to integrate them. So next slide. Okay, so what I want to do today is talk about what we're working on now. Again, the standards of practice were launched in March of this year, and now we've turned our attention. We're in the very early stages of development, but we want to go quickly. So two things. One is tools to assist with navigating, understanding, and adopting the standards of practice. So I'll be walking you through 3 tools that we're developing. And then second, guidance for braiding Indigenous peoples and local communities into restoration. This is stemming from the Global Forum, and Pete and Liat are leads on this as well. Okay, next slide. So I'm really excited to introduce this concept of a multi-tool web-based platform for the standards of practice with 3 components. The first is a navigation tool. The second is an e-learning course. And the third is a decision, and there's a typo, support tool. So the S goes down on the next level. We are aiming to launch a beta version of the platform at the SER World Conference, which is in Colorado next October. And I hope I will be able to visit with some of you there. It's very close to where I live. Yellowstone Park is near there. So I'm going to be plugging the conference a couple of times throughout this talk. We've targeted a designer. We spoke to different designers who could help build this platform, and we've targeted one, probably going to pronounce this wrong. It's a Spanish company, Vielka, and they worked with FAO and WRI on the Aurora tool. We haven't made a decision yet, but this is the leading contender. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the first tool is this interactive and searchable navigation tool. So again, the need for this tool is because our simple plan was to create more than 300 practices. And so not all of the practices will be relevant to every project or achievable by every project. We want to make sure that people can have a way to search for what they need in the document. Next slide. And so some of you were probably thinking when I introduced that flower infographic and it had the components as if you could do those activities sequentially. Of course, in a publication, you are forced into this sequential listing, but on a website, through navigation links, you can help people to move around. So for instance, the last component in the book sequentially is monitoring, but you have to develop your monitoring plan when you develop your restoration plan. So using navigation links, people can get to where they need, or, you know, they can order from what they need to do in the process. Okay, next slide. The other cool thing about the this searchable tool is that we can post all of those guidance documents that we built the standards of practice upon and in a searchable way. So if you're working on coral reef restoration, you can search for that guidance document, and you can also search throughout the standards of practice for things that might be relevant. Next slide. This is the last sort of key feature, is that we'll have language translation through this web portal. Okay, next slide. I want to pause, and how I've set up this talk is I have these 3 tools and then the guidance document, and I've left time for Q&A, feedback, and inputs because that is really the goal. But I'm just going to do maybe just 5 minutes high level. This is like whet your appetite, and then hopefully we can interact more if you're interested in being engaged. And I'll also send out a survey to capture your feedback and inputs too. So I'll just open up the floor, and hopefully I'll be able to hear everyone in the room, or if you're online, I suppose you could raise your hand. And if there's no questions now, there'll be another Q&A after the next section.
Not for now, but I'm sure that will be coming soon.
Okay, I'm sure there's going to be, next slide. I'm sure there's going to be a lot after this next one, and actually we really need some feedback here. So the second tool is an e-learning course, and this is being supported. It'll be on the multi-tool platform, but it's being supported by FAO's e-learning unit. It is going to have a scenario-based approach where in the introductory chapter, a landscape, seascape with multiple interacting ecosystems is presented and will be referenced back to. But then throughout the course, there'll be examples from real ecosystems. And the course includes 6 lessons. So there's an introductory lesson and then 1 lesson for each component. Next slide. Okay, so this just each of these colored bars is a lesson, and this is, like I said, very early stages. So these lessons have not yet been developed, but you know, assessment, planning, and design, et cetera. I've already gone through what's in there. They would be set up as lessons. Okay, next slide. We are putting together an expert working group for this e-learning course. If you have bandwidth for adding something else on your plate, please let me know. The working group is going to help with developing the practical examples for each of the lessons, providing feedback on each lesson, and then attending bi-monthly meetings. We already have some folks from the Best Practices Task Force of the UN Decade, and that's the FAO-led task force, who've agreed to be on our expert working group. And I hope we can also get some folks from CEM to join the working group. So again, I'll be sending out information, or just feel free to email me. The plan for developing the course, in case you're thinking about joining, is to do each of the lessons sequentially. And then once the lesson is done, ask for inputs and feedback, and then, you know, revise that one, move on to the next one, rather than asking for feedback on the whole entire thing. We are also welcoming people to join the expert working group if you just have a particular thing you want to give feedback in, meaning if you agree to help, you don't have to agree to review the whole thing, because it really is a big effort. Okay, next slide. FAO is really jumping to get this e-learning course done. So I'm really certain that we'll stay on schedule to have at least a beta version available at the conference, the World Restoration Conference next October. We already started this introductory lesson. It will have a video explaining restoration, what the course is about, the target audience. It's introducing these characters. We've had a lot of back and forth about the characters, by the way, and then an overview of the content. Next slide. Again, what's in this introductory lesson so far? First introduces the learning objective and then the scenarios. It provides overview of the decade and then provides like the ecological context. What is an ecosystem? What is a landscape and seascape? Talks about ecological integrity and degradation and the UN decade ecosystem types. Then we go into restoration and the restorative continuum, the principles and the standards of practice. Okay, at the end, there's an assessment at the end of each of the lessons. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I wanted to take a minute and hopefully you guys will have some ideas for me here because one of the complications is this idea of the scenario. So I've put up a graphic here. This is not the scenario. Don't worry, this is not the scenario that we're thinking of using in the course. The scenario would not be a real place. But this is from a mountains to sound, ocean project in close to where I live. And I put it up to say that the scenario needs to include multiple land uses, multiple interacting ecosystems, the socio-ecological context, all of that. And I think it's going to be one of the most challenging parts of the e-learning course to develop. We don't want it to reflect any particular biome. We don't want it to be a tropical system or a temperate system. We want it to be the components of ecosystems and landscapes that apply across the board. But then within the lessons, there would be examples of real world restoration projects, ecosystems, and landscapes. And we have been talking about potentially using the UN Decade flagships for some of those examples. We'd be happy to feature examples from our CEM network. But again, you guys know, because many of you have been involved in sort of developing case studies and whatnot, it takes a lot of time. So I would love some thoughts, feedback, inputs here on the scenario and the examples or really anything you have from your experience on the e-learning course. Or I could move on to the next tool. So we'll take a minute. And while you're thinking, oh, you got something?
Yeah, David, just a second.
Hi, Cara, how are you doing?
Hi.
Yeah, sounds like a great idea. I was just mulling over that nice way of dealing with that trade-off between generality and specificity that you were just saying with examples. And maybe one way to think about the coverage of the examples is to use the biomes in the ecosystem typology, which will lead you to examples that cover tropical forests and wetlands, grasslands, different kinds of systems that would span a broad coverage of different types of sensitivities and requirements for restoration.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I think we could, for instance, have 10 biomes, from the topology, and then we repeatedly go to that example from that biome throughout, rather than having 100 different examples. We have 10 and they span biome, exactly like you suggested. I think that's an awesome idea, because then people would learn about that case study and go back to it repeatedly rather than having to learn about 100.
Yeah, and one follow-up. What's the scope you're considering? Are you venturing into freshwater, aquatic and marine as well?
Yeah, and so what we have been talking about for our scenario, so the scenario would be about really education about the attributes of ecosystems and landscapes and subsidies across them. And so we want the scenario to go from mountains to ocean. And you could almost, they're like ecosystem independent, could be a grassland or a forest or whatever, because we want to be emphasizing the ecological attributes that cross type of ecosystem in the scenario, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Probably question, in fact, you could have more than one example each time accumulating over time. So do you think that the e-learning system will kind of evolve over time? Because one thing is, when you think about that, going from A to Z, there are projects that have been very good at doing that, but there are not that many. And so that's the thing is we know from the UNDK the case studies. So that's the thing is, adding over time more to add more would probably help, especially in terms of all the different ecosystems, seascape and landscape, because it can be quite different.
Yeah, I just wrote that down. That's really important to me to be adaptively adding, and I'll ask about that. And for those of you who've reviewed the flagship nominations for the UN Decade, we use the languages in there now, which I'm very happy with, that they're promising examples rather than amazing, outstanding examples. What we're hoping is to highlight something that the flagship has done really well. Like maybe one flagship did really well with stakeholder mapping and engagement. So we'll highlight that from that project rather than highlighting it equally across it, if there's 10 different or 50 different projects. But I'm going to move on so I stay on time, but David, you would be amazing to help unpack the scenario if you wanted to give us the gift of a couple of hours once we've, maybe have some alternatives, and others of you there too. Would really love your expertise to be infused into this. And I also want to make one comment because I know we've had this issue come up. You take a course and you get something like a certificate, and FAO originally proposed that they would get a certificate in ecosystem restoration. And I have advocated for getting a course completion certificate. So that's what they get. They get a certificate that they completed this web-based course, and not that they're like a certified practitioner in restoration. So I'll keep you guys posted on that, but I did wanted to share, trying to represent our perspective from what we learned from the MBS course. All right, you guys ready for the third tool? I'm really excited about this one. I'm still a little new to talking about it, so we'll see how I do here. Oh, can you advance to the next slide? Okay, so the third really important tool is, I mentioned the 300 plus practices. What's a community group going to do? Like, it's just a little bit overwhelming. And so we wanted to have a tool that would help both with decision support, but also with assessing how many of these recommended practices you're getting into your project. And our approach to developing this decision support tool was a little bit like the approach to the principles and the standards. We started with a stock taking of all the different tools that were out there. I found some really cool stuff. Like, I don't know if anyone uses Meraki for the open standards for conservation, but that is a very cool sort of project management tool. And it also walks you through a theory of change. There's a tool for indicators and monitoring that WRI and FAO put out called Aurora, and it goes to their like roadmap document. So we did a pretty deep assessment, and we wanted to create something that would add value. And so what we are proposing, and we have done a couple of consultations on this, we're still doing more targeted consultations, but we're proposing a survey-based tool. That's the format, the vehicle. So I haven't said what it's going to do yet. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and so in going through the survey for each, there'd be some filtering above based on your type of project. So that would be by your biome and by your community group or, you know, federal agency, that would filter out the 300 practices to a more manageable list. And then the person completing the survey for each recommended practice would either say, yep, we're doing our stakeholder mapping, and there would be an open-ended comment box for them to put in some detail about what they're doing. Or they could say, nope, we're choosing not to do this, and there'll be some preset responses as to why. Don't have capacity, don't understand, don't think this is relevant. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then after completing the survey, or before completing the survey, the project who's completing the survey can opt to share their responses with the global restoration community, and even to link with the firm, which is the UN Decades Monitoring Registry, or they can keep it private. They don't need to share anything. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so here's what I'm really excited about are the outputs of doing this exercise. Why would anyone want to do this survey? The output of the survey would be a customizable project plan that detailed the selected practices for your project. So this would come out as like a Word file that you could add your logos to, add more on context, background, or whatnot. But it would be useful to projects because it would be the starting point for developing this restoration plan that they need to do. Anyway, to do best practice, communicate with stakeholders and funders and everyone else. So that's the first output. Second output. Oh, next slide. Sorry. The second thing is there would be a checklist for self-assessment. So this would be like implementation, a checklist for projects to check their implementation of what they said they were going to do. And this could be generating an initial list or making, doing reporting later in time. And next slide. The third output would be data that we would have from everyone who opted in. So we'd have global metadata on the frequency of use of practices and limitations. So perhaps nobody knows how to do stakeholder mapping. And that could be used for capacity development, you know, wealth of information that we could use in a variety of ways, reconsidering the next version of the standards of practice. Okay, next slide. Okay, so again, I'm putting up, you know, the two types of projects in my community and making this point. I'm an educator, so I'm an optimist. And, you know, I believe that when people have better information, they're going to make better decisions. And I think that's really the promise of the standards of practice. They're voluntary, these, you know, recommended practices. But in reading through the full set of practices and walking through them in a guided way, we're hoping that we're really going to be able to optimize benefits to nature and people from restoration. And, you know, we spent a lot of effort, the global restoration community, in developing these standards of practice. So it would be a shame if it didn't make a difference on the ground. All right, next slide. All right, so now we'll pause and see what you guys think. I'll also say that we, in addition to some consultations with groups about whether they thought this would be useful for them, we also did meet with the designer, and they were pretty enthusiastic that this would, they thought it was a cool idea. These are the people who developed Aurora, that monitoring tool, and they also thought that it would not be too complicated to design. All right, what do you guys think?
Thanks, Carl. I'm happy to see this. And I had a question as you talk about decision-making tool.
Yeah,
By the way, we have never met, I guess. My name is Charles Karangwa. I work for IUCN. I'm based in Atlanta.
awesome.
Yeah. So I was heading forest landscape restoration before, so for Africa,
Okay,
based in Nairobi, and I do remember quite a number of years ago, IUCN have worked a lot on forest restoration and forest landscape restoration. Together with CM, there was this tool which is called the ROM, Restoration
Yes.
Assessment Methodology. I think it has been applied by far
yeah,
more than 72 countries to really decide what would their restoration look like, what are the packages, etc. So, and what I liked about that, so I was leading an application of it in many countries, on the continent in Africa, was that it was really bottom-up kind of, so it combines biophysical, socioeconomic, cultural features, and then multi-criteria analysis of the opportunities.
yeah.
It was developed with WRI as well, I think it was. I'm wondering, with the changes to ecosystem restoration, it looks like we are losing those valuable products that actually we had
Yeah.
years. So why that was really forest type of focused?
Yeah,
Putting to move into marine and cover other ecosystems because it had really the features which were correct. So I'm wondering
yeah.
if that's something you're looking at as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy that you made that comment. So I mentioned when we developed the standards of practice that we didn't start from scratch. We used all of that existing guidance. So the Rome was one of those products. So that is baked into the standards of practice and along with, you know, guidance in coral systems, in agroecological systems. And so these standards of practice does not negate the need for biome ecosystem specific guidance. And we've tried to be very clear about that. And in tool 1, the navigation tool, we will be linking foreshore to the Rome. With respect specifically to the Rome, that is about landscape prioritization, which would occur before these standards of practice apply, because these standards of practice are recommendations for the project level. So we don't have a lot of guidance about how to prioritize where to do your project. That's something that I've spent a lot of time on, but this really picks up once that Rome has been done and the stakeholders have agreed where those projects are going in, if that makes sense. But thank you for those
I had a
comments.
follow-up question on that. 'Cause
Yeah.
So what comes on my desk most of the time, working on nature-based solutions are questions like, we have a forest restoration project, is it NPS? And we have used the ecosystem restoration standard, we have done this. What are the gaps there? And I think what Emmanuel had proposed, now that we have the ecosystem restoration standard, the nature-based solution standard, and I sometimes look at the features of the definitions, the action to restore. How the question is always, what is what? Is a good project of restoration immediately a nature-based solution, or is it not? So I think as the lead commission, I'm wondering, and you have the two in your limits,
Yeah,
would there be a possibility
yeah,
to clarify those linkages?
yeah. That's a great comment. We need a Venn diagram or something like that. And, you know, yeah, point well taken. And thank you for making that. I really appreciate it.
I would, if I may, I would add, can you hear me, Kara?
Yes, I can.
I would, sorry. Can you hear me? No.
Yeah,
I would just add that, I mean, Angela and myself have discussed a lot, you know, because we have similar questions about, is this actually an NBS? Is this concept an NBS? And really, it's so context dependent. It's so
Mhm.
specific to the type of intervention, the type of societal challenges that are addressed, how the project is, you know, being managed, planned, and so on. It's not like about one concept. Forest landscape restoration is not necessarily an intervention. Doesn't have to be an MBS. Same with ecosystem restoration. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
It's really depending on different things, and this is why we have the A criteria and the global standard. But it would be nice to do something, yes.
Yeah, I think it's always important to help people understand these relationships, and why we have these different terms. So I've noted that as a to-do action item.
Yeah.
I have one other guidance I don't know, guidance document I want to present. So I really welcome, hopefully I'll see some of you in Colombia at COP16, but I really welcome all of your ideas and thoughts. I know there's a tremendous amount of expertise within this group here. So if you're thinking, that you have something to offer, you want to be involved, we need all of you. So let me know. All right, let's go to the next one. This is very short. I'm getting short on time. Oh, sorry, just a pitch that we are going to be getting feedback on these guidance and tools in a session in the IUCN Pavilion at COP16. And so again, the focus of that session is to share information, what exists, but also to get feedback and inputs for the things we're in the process of developing. Okay, next slide. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is an ongoing initiative, and these are my words. This is something that Pete, Liette, Angela, and I have been working on. I'll just read: guidance for braiding Indigenous peoples and local communities into ecosystem restoration. I'm not sure my preposition is the right way to express this here, but the fact that I'm struggling to talk about it highlights the need for additional guidance. So let's go to the next slide. So I mentioned we took a year and did an Indigenous peoples consultation as part of the development of the standards of practice. It was a huge learning experience for me. We have these boxes within the standards of practice. We also have within each of the subcomponent specific practices related to Indigenous peoples, like FRIP and data custody rights and all kinds of things. Let's go to the next slide. So about a year ago, we launched the 5th Global Forum on Ecosystem Restoration. This is an every other year event that we do in collaboration with the Society for Ecological Restoration, usually in conjunction with their World Congress, which is biennially. And the focus of the 5th Global Forum was on social and cultural aspects, dimensions of ecological restoration. And through a series of workshops there, we identified, the initial workshop in Australia and virtual workshops after, we identified that there was a key gap, and that was really specific guidance for engaging with Indigenous peoples and infusing restoration with their ideas and knowledge, and also having their engagement. And so we put together the bones of a plan, and now we're moving into the operational phase of that. And Liette is our lead on this for this operational phase and development of the guidance document. And Liette, I believe you have a co-chair on this now, right? Co-lead. Can you guys hear me? Oh, no. Hello?
Yes,
Yes,
Okay.
we hear
Oh,
you.
Okay,
And
perfect.
yeah, and I was saying that we have Gary Pritchard, who is a SCR certified practitioner in restoration, but indigenous as well. And so, yeah, and right now he's in the woods hunting because it's the hunting season for indigenous people.
Yeah.
So as he's coming back, we are going to start working a little bit more on the details and having the working group meetings starting
Yeah.
again.
Perfect. And so I think this is really exciting. We had great participation by Indigenous peoples in our virtual webinars. We did a series of 2 of them, and there's a lot of excitement about this guidance document. And so we've talked about, having it include a synthesis of existing guidance, who has put this together. We didn't see a lot when we developed the standards of practice. And so this would really be unpacking all that rich detail. So again, you're invited to join. We're just amping up in this work, and then hopefully we will be able to add this potentially into future revisions of the standard of practice and all of our work processes. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm at the end of my hour. I just, thank you so much for including me on the agenda, even though I couldn't be in person in Columbia. Really appreciate it. I've put up a snip from the SCR World Conference in Ecological Restoration, September 30th to October 4th next year. I would be really excited if there's a CM steering committee meeting or other sort of CM events if we have critical mass coming to the meeting. And by the way, it's a great time to visit Yellowstone and go check out, bears and look for wolves and see the great North American mammals. So I will personally be your host. If you're coming to the meeting, let me know.
Thank you, Cara. Thank you very much for the great presentation. Yeah, I'm very glad to see the recent results, especially of the consultation process, in which I couldn't be more personally, but I know from you and what happened. And also the importance of the added value of the consultation with the indigenous people. At the beginning, we thought that it might be difficult, complicated, but at the end, in my personal view, he's provided a very high level to the standard of practice, because I think it's an amazing added value of what was developed. And I think we have to learn in all other products the relevance of that, because people are always asking how the Commission is engaging with indigenous people and things like that is something that is not easy. They have been also asking for MBS, for the red list of ecosystems, and there are some ideas, but I think that here there are very good and clear examples of how to engage with local communities in this case. So thank you very much for that. And looking forward to see you in Cali. I think from this group, I don't know. I think I will be the only one with Johnny.
Johnny's going.
Yeah. With
And
Johnny.
that's it? Everybody's leaving Columbia before? No, that's too sad.
But there will be also other people, of course. We cannot. I'm Paula. Sorry, Paula.
Oh, awesome. Great. Well, I look forward to that. And well, I guess I will say then, since I won't see many of you in Cali, Denver, Colorado, September 30th. Yeah.
In preparation to the World Conservation Conference.
It's very
We can go there.
Last questions with the WC.
Oh, yes.
No,
The other
It's
one.
not clashing, it's.
It's 1 week in between.
It's 1 week in between, right?
So I would say on the way,
Flying as far as
on the
possible.
way to the World Conservation Congress, we stop over in,
Oh, my
Yeah.
goodness,
Colorado,
that's gonna be a
yeah.
busy time. Yeah.
yes.
Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Cara. I know that you are very busy with other events, so we can continue the discussion and the conversation, but thank you for all the,
Yeah,
Sure.
oh, and I will send, I'll send like something to get your feedback. I'll work on that today, like a little survey, just so if you're thinking about the presentation, you can just communicate with me quickly.
yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Sarah.
Bye.